today. I'm Erica Steckler from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the International Humanistic Management Society. This is actually almost our 10th year of the Necessary Conversation series, so stay tuned for a nice celebration to come. Necessary Conversations are sponsored by the Donahue Center for Business Ethics and Social Responsibility in the Manning School of Business, and also hosted by the Gabelli School of Management at Fordham University. The series is also part of the working group on humanistic management through the United Nations Principles for Responsible Management Education. So welcome from all of these various communities. I'm going to first, before I introduce Chris, invite Michael Pearson to say a few words on behalf of the International Humanistic Management Society, IHMA.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Chris, for being here, and thank you everybody for joining. As Erica was saying, this is almost the 10th year in which we're doing these conversations, and we dubbed them necessary because, yeah, there are many conversations happening and many conversations that you read in the news, that you see on YouTube, etc. And there are some important conversations that are seemingly missing, even in our academic spaces. And so that's what the platform is for, that we're having a space for conversations that are truly necessary. And given the times that we're in, maybe overdue. And so that we're providing here with the internet, at least think about. And so there is a strong academic tradition, which is rooted in the humanities, that somehow doesn't really find its way into the more professional schools of business, the science of economics, which isn't really a science, but has, what if we were to actually rethink some of those bases? That's what the conversation in the Humanistic Management Association is about. And then we will invite those that have basically done work in that space, the platform to share what the insights are. And so thank you, Chris, Marquis, for being here, because yes, you're just one such person, and it's fantastic to have you in the space. So thank you, Erica, for making this available. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Great. Thanks, Michael. So again, welcome to today's International Humanistic Management, that's IHMA, Necessary Conversation with Dr. Chris Twist. Today we're talking about a recent book, The Profiteer Socializes Cost. I'll do a brief introduction of Chris and then turn it right over. Just a couple of muted. I think we can control that, but please do try to keep yourself muted. If you have questions, comments, resources you'd like to share, please do share those in the chat. And we will moderate Q&A, which is about the second half of our time together, our conversation from the chat. Wonderful. Well, again, welcome. I'd like to introduce Dr. Christopher Marquis, who is the Senior Professor of Management at the University of Cambridge and author of The Profiteers: How Business Privatizes Profits and Socializes Costs. His research examines business sustainability and social entrepreneurship, and he's written 2 prior award-winning books, including Better Business: How the B Corps Movement is Remaking Capitalism, and Mao and the Markets: The Communist Roots of Chinese Enterprise. The latter was a Financial Times Best Book of 2022. Chris is very passionate about academic research and helping people around the world to address some of the biggest crises of our time, including climate change, inequality, and discrimination. Before Cambridge, Chris also worked at Cornell, at Harvard University, and also spent some time at the University of Michigan, as well as with JP Morgan Chase prior to all of this. So Chris, welcome. We're thrilled for you to be here today, and we can dive straight in. Thank you.
Super. Yeah, no, thank you so much for the great, very kind introduction, Erica. Also great to hear a little bit more about this series of discussions, and really honored to be part of it, because certainly, trying to orient our thinking on important societal and environmental issues in a much more sort of humanistic well-being way, sort of transitioning from a lot of the thought in economics is really one of my personal missions. So it's great to be talking with all of you today. So I'll go through, I have some slides on this new book. I have a couple other things that connect to that I've been working on more recently. And yeah, I'll get started. People sometimes ask me, what the book is about, and I had this little animation done, which sort of covers it. I don't know if you can see this animation that's going on the screen here. So, all right. So I think a lot of us, if not all of us, are concerned about the state of the world, climate change, the extent of environmental disasters and challenges we're facing are tremendous. We see this, nowadays, many of the sort of leading global folks in the environmental space or in Azerbaijan, trying to come to some agreements on various things like climate finance and various goals around emissions, huge amounts of challenges. At least myself and many of you on the call who I know are from business schools. And I think sometimes people forget about the important role of business in addressing many of these, huge challenges. Of course, we need policy innovation and interventions. Of course, we as individuals need to be, responsible in our behavior. But, in many cases where the rubber meets the road on these questions of climate and inequality, discrimination, are actually within business organizations and things that us as business leaders or sort of professors and academics teaching the leaders of tomorrow, these are really important things that we can affect. And so this is in many ways the areas that I've been focusing on. A number of you may have seen this cartoon before. I think it really encapsulates things very, very nicely as far as some of the challenges that we have. And I think that in many ways, building off Michael's opening statement about how a lot of the sort of assumptions and best practices of how business and the broader economic and market system have been operating have been very much driven from a short-term shareholder or owner focused system. So, company tremendous amounts of incentives from state, laws in many cases are oriented around short-term shareholder primacy. And this, really ignores the more humanistic priorities and purpose than this period. This is only really a 50-year period where we've had this really narrow focus on short-term shareholder primacy. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge because, in many cases, I think business leaders and even the general public think, just natural that business should be focusing on delivering value for shareholders. But this is something that has been constructed by a bunch of interested actors and is actually, really very much just emblematic of this historical period that we're in. And what that means is that we can actually work to change it. And that's in many cases what I've been focused on. There's been some discussion of ways of changing it, in order to focus business much less on short-term shareholders and more on stakeholders. You're probably familiar with these things like the Business Roundtable, World Economic Forum has come out around stakeholder capitalism. And, these were met with pretty widespread praise in the media. Maybe some economists, wrote things and said this is bad because, really profit. Seriously, people wrote this, this actually focusing on broader stakeholders is actually a bad thing because, business should really just be about profit. But that has taken hold in a lot of teaching in business schools in the broader sort of ethos. And I think this is in some ways been a helpful set of discussions, but is very, very far from what is needed or what is enough. And I think that there's a lot of issues with this idea of so focusing mainly on stakeholders and stakeholder capitalism, which really motivated the book. And I think that, looking at the Business Roundtable in their work, I think really helps unpack some of the issues that I have with a stakeholder perspective. So first, I should say the Business Roundtable you may be familiar with. It's this group of about 200 of the largest companies, trade group, sort of like a supervillain society, I heard it referred to as, that is very active in sort of creating the cultural agenda for large business and also working with the government on policy, that affects business. This idea of actually focusing on stakeholders, which they articulated as what the sort of explicitly stated purpose of the corporation, should be for their members, came under they came under attack for this pretty quickly because there were a lot of examples of companies that were appearing to not follow through on this. So Marriott was one that got pretty early attack during early days of COVID. Obviously, a challenge for a company like Marriott because people were not traveling. So hotels were not, they didn't really have much of a need for employees or to actually be operating, and so they laid off a lot of their employees, which I mean, I am sympathetic to. I mean, if you are not actually operating your business, you have to, sometimes have to think about making some hard choices. However, what actually this article exposed, and I think really sort of shows at a more deep level their commitment, is that in addition to, laying off earlier than many other companies, their employees, cutting back their healthcare, they also increased their dividend and gave their CEO a raise. So, the idea that they're saying they're focusing on stakeholders, I think is pretty questionable when, they are actually delivering value to their, through dividend to their shareholders while they're, sadly cutting back on their employee benefits. Part of an issue, I do think that businesses would learn a little more about this. When you say things publicly, those can then be things that people check on. And there's been a number of sort of academic papers, analyses, a number of journalistic investigations from The Guardian. I think Business Week did one about now that they made this statement in 2019. So now, like 5 years later, how are they doing? Has this actually made an impact? And so here is a quote, actually, I think it's from the abstract of this paper, which is published. These are finance professors. I think one is at Columbia, one is at LBS. So, people that are, very rigorous academic researchers. This is from an SSRN version, but it's going to be published in Finance Journal. So relative to peers, the Business Roundtable companies violate environmental and labor laws more frequently, have higher carbon emissions, rely more on government subsidies, and are more likely to disagree with proxy recommendations on shareholder proposals. This is even, I'm somewhat cynical about companies' motivations, and this is even surprising to me because, I wouldn't think necessarily that they would just immediately shift this focusing on stakeholders, but the fact that they're doing worse, I think really says something. And one of the other papers by Professor Wharton tries to explain this, why this is, and likens it to moral licensing at the corporate level. So moral licensing, it typically refers to individual behavior where, if you do something good, you feel licensed to do something bad. So a simple example is, I go out for a run or I do some yoga early in the morning. Maybe I feel like, oh yeah, like that donut or that dessert after lunch. Yeah, I can do that because I did something good earlier. So here the idea being that, they've gotten all this praise and publicly stated their focus on the environment and focus on, community. So they feel emboldened to do things less good. Interesting sort of idea. But this isn't just a few academic studies, a number of journalistic investigations, rigorous journalistic investigations have looked at it too. Also, it's not surprising then that their lobbying activities, I think, are pretty unstakeholder friendly. They were really against the Inflation Reduction Act and a variety of the SEC accounting around the environment. So what I guess my one of the things I critique this idea, this business roundtable a bit in the book, and also try to develop into a bigger argument that we need to go beyond just actually talking and thinking about stakeholders. The idea of sort of stakeholder capitalism, so to speak, that businesses should focus on stakeholders, I think provides a lot of cover for some negative behaviors, which I think the Business Roundtable example exemplifies. So one, simply sort of selective disclosure greenwashing. So businesses, they can point to these positive things that they're doing or saying in certain realms, which then obscures maybe some deeper problems in their overall business or in other realms. So I think it provides can provide a platform for greenwashing. I think another sort of issue with it is that the idea of stakeholders is very much about this sort of a little bit more of a long-term calculus around profitability. So, if you read the Business Roundtable statement, there's a letter that goes along with the statement, and it says, basically what this means is that we will by, serving our employees better, our communities better, we'll have longer-term economic benefits through that, and it'll actually lead to our profitability. But there's been a lot of work on trying to connect these, social responsibility or sustainability and financial performance. And I think, I'll say a little bit more about that. The evidence is really a little questionable. So I think that also this is another issue with the stakeholder, stakeholder idea. Another, there's a long history and there's sets of research in our literatures that look at how companies try to take on voluntary reform to really forestall or delay or put off more rigorous governmental reform. And I think that's the case here. My opening slide, I mean, there's a lot of problems in the world. People are pointing the finger at businesses. And, if businesses don't come together and say, we got this, we not only do we got this, but it's in our self-interest because there's this win-win. So you can trust us to actually, take care of things ourselves. We don't need stricter regulation. I think that, is not to be too skeptical, but I think that actually underlies a lot of the motivation around this as opposed to doing good. So sort of one other example of this that I think really illustrates this point is Pepsi. Pepsi is a company that has been lauded for its stakeholder work, its work in agriculture, its employee focused work. This Just Capital, this is an organization which is now pretty well known. They offer these America's Most Just Companies, which is basically about sort of their stakeholder performance. And Pepsi has always been one of the top companies. There's another, if you look at the top 10, it's immediately apparent that they're not looking at the right things, in my opinion. Because if you think about Pepsi, they may be doing something around regenerative agriculture in part of their supply chain. They may be treating their employees well. And that's all great. I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't be doing that. But also, if we're going to think about whether a company like Pepsi is actually sustainable or responsible, we need to look deeper. And we need to look at their business model, and in some ways, what is the purpose of their organization? And I think arguably, if we do that for Pepsi, they would not be one of America's most just companies. They would actually be one of America's least just companies because they have, through their products, significantly contributed to a lot of the public health problems we have. And of course, some people will say, well, consumers, they have a choice. They don't have to buy, these products. But if you look at actually the work that they do lobbying and actually how they've worked to formulate ingredients and get ingredients like high fructose corn syrup to be able to be used in places like the US where they can't use them other places, their Frito-Lay division, snack foods engineered to be addictive. I think there's an argument to say that actually this is not something where we put the onus on consumers. We need to actually hold them accountable for this. And, environmental damage and waste, they're very big, very big plastic polluters. Anyway, so the win-win, I mentioned this in the interest of time because I do have a reasonable amount of slides. I'm going to skip skip over this a bit, but there's been a lot of debunking of a lot of the win-win argument and doing well by doing good, both the articles that have existed and as well just just the general idea that maybe there are, and it's a very seductive argument because clearly there are examples where through energy efficiency or other means companies can save money, but actually to solve the serious problems or to actually reorient and think about their business model, I think it's a fool's errand. I think from a research standpoint, I know, so that's in some ways the accountability we need to bring to companies, but also I think our research perspectives on this, as many, if not all of us on the call are sort of academics, I think we also need to really be rethinking this. So here is an article that some of you may be familiar with this. It's a pretty well-known article from 2003, I believe, in ASQ, Administrative Science Quarterly, by Josh Margolis and Jim Walsh. The reason I put this up here is that actually I was a student at Michigan with studying under Jim, and I didn't even realize actually until I was getting ready that actually, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but he thanks his class of Corporation Society, which is why I was in that class, and which is why I put this up here, that we actually read an early version of that in the reviews. And I remember Jim, some of you may know him, saying that it's crazy, people have published like 100 papers on this connection between CSR and CFP, corporate social responsibilities. It was corporate social performance and corporate financial performance. It's crazy. People just study this this topic so much, and they came out pretty equivocal. And they actually you can see here, if you read this quote here, the now 30-year search for an association between CSP and CFP reflects an enduring quest to find a persuasive business case for social initiatives. So part of the issue, I think, with not only is it sort of an easy pill for the executives, but also so we as academics think we need to, and all of a sudden, if companies think will financially keep doing it, is that I went and looked then and saw that actually, it's got exponentially increased. And this, the most recent meta-analysis that had, sort of what they claim to be the universal studies on it was only through 2018. And my guess is now, if you follow this trend, there's 10,000 of these studies. This is crazy to me. People still today are focusing on this topic of connecting in some way social responsibility to financial performance. Like what more can be done after 10,000 studies? I don't know. So anyways, this is I don't know if Albert Einstein actually said this. It's sort of, there's questions about this, but it was sort of a good slide that I found online. So what I argue in the book is that we need to actually not just think about stakeholders, but we need to think about the actual business model and purpose of the company, and not just select the positives, but the positives and particularly the negatives. We need to actually hold companies accountable for their negative impacts on society. And let's think over this. And one of the ways that I sort of unpack that is through the topic of externalities. Some of you, there may be some economists on the call, on the discussion. Not to sort of double down on Michael's sort of implicit diss of economists, but whenever I talk about this and economists are in the room, not all the time, but it has happened more than once. They say, "Oh, we have figured this out. You're just talking about externalities. We just, find a price or a market, and this will sort itself." And I think, this is actually one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because I think that is a very, simplistic, naive, and sort of fundamentally wrong way to actually to think about the situation. I think the pricing in markets is important to try to get our head around what externalities are. Here, there's a great article about a month or two ago in the New York Times that went through this, and you can see here, just an example of beef. The price at the retail is $5, $5.50, but really there's all these environmental costs from emissions, from water use, from ecosystem effects, et cetera. I think that sort of looking at something like this is helpful because you can see that there's a lot of costs that society and the environment bear, but that companies don't and probably should. But I think that it actually, by quantifying it like this, it actually really makes it seem a bit more sort of scientific, and may miss a lot of things. So let me say a bit about this. So one of the things I cover in the book, I'm not going to be able to cover some of the favorite things I end up writing about, but I'm not going to be able to cover in this talk today, but happy to talk more, is how much sort of lobbying, communications, PR companies do to actually avoid the perception of externalities. So one example is around recycling, particularly plastic recycling. Again, to sort of double down on my critique of Pepsi, there are very low rates of plastic recycling. Unfortunately, even things you put in the plastic in the recycling bin, end up being sort of burned or thrown in landfill. But they still are out there running ads. There's this one ad that I saw not that long ago that has, very cheery people, very cheery, young, diverse people from Pepsi, Coke, and Dr. Pepper. And they're saying, we're normally competitors on everything else, but we think recycling is so important that we work together. Well, like recycling doesn't work. So maybe they should be thinking about some other thing, but they want us, the public, to not think that they should be taking responsibility for this in a more fundamental way, but actually, we should be thinking about, our responsibility of taking the can or bottle, et cetera. So part of the issue too is that while that sort of image, that sort of picture with beef looks very, very scientific, actually, there's a tremendous amount of sort of assumptions and sort of creation of boundary conditions that go into actually calculating the sort of economic effects of the various pollution or other externalities. So you can see here, sadly, when I did this slide, I never thought that I would have to sort of update it probably again. I don't know what the sort of Biden sort of calculation is, but this gives an example of just how sort of socially constructed these are. So the Obama administration underwent a very detailed study of what they called the social cost of carbon, which is basically valuing the externalities. They came out at, I think, $42 a ton, which a number of economists have now said that's even very low. It should be $100+. But when Donald Trump took over as president, in 2016, he actually changed one or two assumptions in that model, and it got reduced to a couple dollars a pound. So anyways, so economists like to say we'll price it, but actually I think we need to understand how, very much more deeply sort of the assumptions and what companies are doing to avoid it. I think also, it's easy to say, look at something like beef or carbon emissions. But actually, this idea of externality, as I talk about externalities, I talk in the book, are much more endemic to our system, our economic system. Really, in many ways, in many cases, it's people that are very, very far from us, living in the global north and more developed countries. A lot of the externalities around sort of inequality, human rights, labor abuses are happening, deep in supply chains in the global south. So I think that, we need to think about a much bigger problem than just carbon emissions or various things of pollution. So much of what I said has been pretty, I don't know, negative or critical so far. Actually, a lot of the book, I try to be very constructive because I also think and really show through a lot of examples that actually companies that actually take this on, the idea on that they need to look at their business model, understand not just how can they be positive, but also understand the negative effects. It can actually open up a lot of areas for innovation and creativity. So one example of this is a company, Grove Collaborative, which you may or may not know about. So they're a company that produces, markets, and sells a variety of health and beauty and home goods. You can see sort of some of their products in the background. Behind this is Stu Landsberg, co-founder and chair. And part of the inspiration for writing this book actually came from my discussions with him and many of the other entrepreneurs that I've talked to that have done really, I think, innovative internalization work in this area and very creative practices. So he described that for their industry, plastic is the biggest externality. He used the term externality, and the reason why is obviously we've talked about the plastic pollution issue. To make plastic actually is a variety of chemical processes using petrochemicals. So bad for the environment and emissions there. And what he told me is that actually using virgin plastic is much cheaper to make products than using recycled plastic because of the, I guess, properties of it. It's easier to sort of form and use. And that price difference is really, an externality. They're privatizing the profit of doing something responsible using a better material. So he set out really on this mission to eliminate plastic from their company, and it led them on all kinds of very creative and innovative journeys. One of which I want to say is around there, which they won some awards for. One of which here is their bar shampoo. Now, growing up in the 70s and in 80s, and even up until more recently, I never realized that actually shampoo, you could effectively use shampoo that was not a liquid. This might be old hat to many of you. You might be using this. I now only use bar shampoo after sort of meeting Stu and learning about this. But if you think about, okay, they want to get rid of plastic. So this results in product reformulations, really about starting at the design phase. Also, obviously using different material, but it's not just about doing things that happen after the product is produced or close to but actually thinking about the redesign. And so they have thoroughly redesigned a bunch of their products so they can deliver them to consumers, not in things like plastic or even aluminum, but actually paper, which is more environmentally sustainable. They end up being lighter, so less shipping. They've also come up with a P&L for their business lines around plastic. So they have a pricing plastic. And so, it's always top of mind for managers, and also a badging system so that consumers can really understand better, the sort of plastic content, type of plastic, et cetera. So these are all a set of innovations, both in the design phase as well as business processes around pricing, and then, and then at the consumer level. So, what I think is that, we need to be thinking as business leaders and professors, just sort of advocating business, when we think about sustainability, to really be thinking again about the core business model, but then also the entire, value chain, because a lot of the effects are elsewhere, not just upstream or downstream, or they're not just sort of downstream like recycling. And I have too many more slides, so I'm going to go a little quicker. But this example I'm going to go through too, because it's another example, I think, of the importance of looking at the value chain. So net zero is something that gets a lot of attention. I think most of it is greenwashing. In many ways, the sort of most ridiculous version of that is this example here from Exxon. Exxon has claimed it's going to be net zero. Like the absurdity of a fossil fuel oil company being net zero. I mean, it's sort of interesting, when you sort of dig into the details, of course, they're talking about this and getting a lot of press about this, but they actually have left out the oil that they sell. Their net zero is only about their actually operations. And sure, maybe it starts somewhere, but the fact that they are getting, sort of breaking news on CNBC, Exxon's going to be net zero, but actually they are not even accounting for the core environmentally damaging product that that they you know are sort of producing, and all the misinformation that has gone on with it, I think is kind of ridiculous. This guy Darren Woods, it's not going to be his problem. I mean, he's going to retire by then. Although he was just in the news recently, he was the first CEO that came out and told Donald Trump not to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So you know, that's kudos to him, I guess, on that one. But Allbirds is a company I study a bit in the book that I think has done a very good job of looking end to end. You can see sort of this bar here. I don't know if you can see my cursor move, but they look at all the different steps. They look for materials, they look at manufacturing, they look at transport. A quick example of how this really unlocks innovation, they realized actually when they did this deep assessment that actually the sole of the shoe is the area where the most of the negative environmental impact is, because it's mostly made of plastic. So they went and they actually innovated and developed a new material made of sugarcane that actually is positive, carbon positive. It actually leads, sort of the growing and various processes with this actually take carbon from the atmosphere, or sort of store carbon. And they have, instead of sort of making this their sort of patenting it, making it their own individual IP, they've actually open sourced it and now work with lots of companies to actually introduce this product. So again, another example of thinking deeply about the externalities and actually core business impacts can lead to innovation. I'm going to skip over all of this. It's very much connects to our current day about sort of AI. AI has tremendous potential risks. I mean, there's the risks that get talked about AI, taking over the world basically and subjugating us humans to it, under itself. But I think environmentally and also, socially has huge risks as well. Interestingly enough, these AI companies, here's xAI and Anthropic and also OpenAI, have all said they're going to be governed as a benefit corporation, which is a company that actually has a purpose beyond shareholder primacy. I think this is, a potential step in the right direction, but I think we need to be very careful in not allowing them, like Business Roundtable, in saying they're going to focus on stakeholders, to do this in a way that actually sort of distracts and detracts from more stringent government regulation. I sort of wrote something in Fast Company, which people can take a look at on this. That it's actually, again, I think the benefit corporation form is a very important corporate governance innovation. And many companies like Patagonia and Allbirds and Growth Collaborative actually have all adopted this. The ones I've showed, and tens of thousands of now other companies around the world. So I'm not saying that this is bad, but I think that we need to demand more and demand accountability. The Sackler family actually proposed using this corporate form to reorganize Purdue Pharma, which again also is another example of these just totally absurd things that you see. So their idea was, so let's reorganize as a benefit corporation and keep selling OxyContin in order to fund lawsuits where we made people addicted to OxyContin. So anyways, it is sort of interesting. This is still ongoing. That there was an agreement that the Supreme Court ended up not passing. So anyways, finally, I just want to say, so one of the things I focus on in the book is the idea of trying to create more active thinking around positive externalities, and Patagonia is a great example of this. I sometimes hate to use Patagonia because they are like the poster child for responsible business, but I think here it's really useful to talk about them because they actually went through a mindset shift themselves on this topic. So this person here that I've interviewed a number of times when I've been meeting with people at Patagonia, Vincent Stanley, he described to me that when they got into agriculture business, they learned about regenerative agriculture and the idea that actually if you sort of organize and produce and grow your crops in a way that actually tries to add value, you can actually, create greater sort of biodiversity in the soil and ecosystem, and actually lead to positive externalities as opposed to draining it. And this they then sort of realized that actually in their mission statement they had this statement, do unnecessary harm, which they thought was just crazy because like here they're a business that's focused on the environment, and they admit in their mission statement that they are actually doing harm. And so as a result, they ended up changing their mission statement and doing a lot of really innovative things, I think, around, sort of thoughtful consumption, secondhand marketplaces, repair, reuse, et cetera. So I think that sort of trying to think about ways to innovate around positive externalities is a lot of future work. People may think it's too hard to change, but business leaders are reevaluated. One of my favorite stories around this is Ray Anderson, the CEO of Interface Carpet. He had this epiphany 20 some years ago about how environmentally destructive his business was. And what he said was that someday people like me will go to jail because we are plundering the earth in such an extensive fashion. And you see here this reassessment of Jack Welch, which also, touches on this dominant economic model. He was the manager of the 20th century by Fortune magazine. However, he also just recently gets called out for breaking capitalism because of how destructive the short-term shareholder-focused things are. So anyways, I'll skip over this. So just in the end, let me say, today's day and age, the world is demanding a lot more of companies. I think that this focus of shareholder primacy is pretty widely acknowledged as a root cause issue. But just because we want to get rid of the shareholders and look at wider constituencies doesn't mean just reflexively focus to stakeholders. We need to actually be thinking deeper about the business model of companies and not just what positive it does, but what the negatives do, and actually think about ways of holding the companies accountable for that. And I do think that this is something that will be rewarded for companies in the future. And I think in the businesses that I've studied, actually thinking deeply about the business model has been an incredible unlock for innovation. And so with that, I will stop. Great to be with you. Sorry for going a bit over. I see there's the chat things keeps popping up. Looking forward to talking. You can feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn. You can look me up or scan the QR code here. And very much looking forward to the remaining minutes of discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So much to think about. And again, I shared in the chat that Chris will make the slides available. So look out for those along with the recording. So we've got about 15 minutes and we've structured our necessary conversations for exactly this reason, so we can all have a conversation around it. I see a couple of questions in the chat. I wanted to take advantage of I guess my moderating role to ask the first question.
Good. Great. And I probably won't have time to read. There's 13 of them, so if you're going to moderate, that would be great.
Yep, I'll help you get through the chat. Yeah.
Good. Thanks.
So I'm again, I love so many of the ideas you've shared, and this idea of, again, authenticity and how that's evaluated, I think is so relevant and important and very, very timely. And I love what you ended on in terms of accountability. And so I'm curious if you have a sense of how if we're in the world of scholarship or in the world of leading businesses, how can we move organizations to be more accountable themselves? How can they look inside and hold themselves accountable versus always sort of depending on, well, is someone holding us accountable for these types of actions?
Yeah, great question. And I think that this is something that actually the business school academia, I think, has actually made big progress on, and actually a big contribution so far, so to speak. There is a lot of contention around sort of ESG accountability. And I think, it gets sort of attacked from both the left and the right for different reasons, obviously. But I think that actually the accountability just on ESG is a hugely important foundation for understanding your impacts of just at a very basic level. For instance, Allbird, that they had not actually gone through, in depth trying to understand their carbon footprint and their ESG impact, they would not have really understood actually where to focus their attention. Similarly with Growth Collaborative. So I do think that actually, keeping on the sort of ESG accountability um, sort of agenda. I think keeping that on the agenda, I think, is very important, and I think it's important because actually in Europe there are some new regulations. People might have heard the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, where companies are going to be mandatorily required to report on ESG, and I think this is something that can be very, very helpful actually, because reporting is not going to is not the sort of silver bullet that's going to solve everything. Like I think some people used to maybe think that, but I do think as part of the overall set of what needs to be done, clearly companies need to be deep in their operations and understanding, and not just their own operations. There's a scope 3 idea, which is really sort of the supply, sort of other areas of the value chain besides what's sort of under your form of control, and holding companies accountable for their scope 3 as well.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to back up now in the chat. I think Ravi,
Great.
you had asked the first question. Would you like to join and pose that question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
I asked this question, which you can read in the chat, but I'm concerned because now I'm not trying to make this a politics discussion, but now we're going to have a Department of Efficiency in the government led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. And that's good if you really contain and take care of waste. Waste is a muda, M-U-D-A. Muda is a Japanese term for looking at waste and how it manifests in how we do things like overproduction, weighting, transport, extra processing, inventory. There's so many operational ways in which waste manifests itself. But once you create the value, who captures the value? I fear privatization of Medicare, privatization of healthcare, privatization of even social security and so forth. By reducing waste, value is created, but then the created value is not equitably shared. That's what I fear. So my question is very specific to you. How can we design economic policies that ensure benefits of public investments are equitably shared among all citizens rather than being disproportionately captured by private entities? How do you do that?
Yeah, sure. So I have an opinion on this, although I do want to note, that it is a bit different. So my book is really not looking as much at private, is more about how companies, private actors are basically exploiting, the economic system to get more gains for themselves. And I think that your question is more about making sure that public investment, we make sure that actually gets shared in an effective way by the populace, the people who it's actually supposed to, be engineered for. So, I mean, I don't want to get too political either, to be honest, but I think that the whole privatization focus on efficiency in government is basically a wrong direction. It's hard to say, you don't want to be more efficient, or you don't want to have people be paying too much. But I think that for instance, privatization of so many different services, I mean, what ends up happening then is that you have these companies or private actors that then are focusing on making sure that they're able to make profit as opposed to actually deliver the good for that is supposed to be delivered by the government. And so, you think about what the logic of government should be. It should be about, effective delivery of services and benefits to its populace, and efficiency, not as the top order. I mean, it should be, certainly considered. I think resilience is a factor that should be considered a lot more. And I think in many cases where government sometimes optimizes is around resilience and making sure that we're ready. We have these stockpiles of vaccines and various things. I mean, it's not very efficient to do that because they expire, but actually for the resilience of us, that's just a simple example, I think. So anyways, it sounds like I'm on the sort of same page as you. I think that the privatization and the Department of Government Efficiency, I think will detract from the public good.
Thanks. I see also a question from Sigrun. If you're still here, you're welcome to ask the question, and hopefully we can get another 2 or 3 questions in. So thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Chris, for your talk. I tried to sort of do that in my teaching as well, sort of explaining that sort of what we see, that the price system doesn't really reflect all of the costs. And I'm sort of trying various things out. So I'm also on the shampoo bar segment.
Good.
But I'm also noticing I'm a professor, so I can afford products that are more expensive that reflect the costs. But I'm really keen to understand how can businesses offer such products that are affordable to a wider range of consumers, because in the long term it is cheaper to buy sustainable products. But how can somebody, for example, if I think of period pants, it's an investment to buy those, whereas a packet of tampons that you buy every month is much more affordable for somebody on a lower income. I can think of other products as well. If you think of Patagonia, who can afford a 200, 300, 400 pound jacket from Patagonia, when you can get a cheap one for 20, 30 pounds that you can afford, but that might not last the year or the summer or the winter, for that matter. So that's really sort of a question that I'm grappling with, that I'm realizing also my own privilege in being able to afford that. But how can we make this more accessible?
This is a super. I discuss this a bit in the book, but probably in an unsatisfactory way, to be honest, because it is a huge challenge, and this is something that a lot of times, when we start talking about externalities, the question then becomes, I mean, who ends up paying for it, and is this something that the companies will just pass on to consumers, and then that makes it, I mean, that's not what we want either necessarily. So, I focus a reasonable amount. So first of all, I do think that there's something to be said for actually companies' sort of innovation. And, if, let's say, a government, so let me back up a second. I think that, I gave examples of companies doing things voluntarily, but to me, we really need a lot more policy around in these areas. And so, like, if we have policies around companies being net zero, then there actually, I think, will be a lot of creativity and innovation from companies to actually end up delivering on that. So I think that there will be some possibly changes in price, but also there will be I don't think it'll entirely. I mean, I think actually only probably a small portion will end up going to the consumers. I think also, we are now in a very fast fashion era of consumption, and trying to reorient around not just buying disposable things, I think is another, sort of useful item. And I do want to finally sort of close with an example that I talk about in the book, is a Dutch nonprofit called True Price. And they have actually worked very hard to actually price externalities for a lot of different products, particularly products that are produced in the global South, and work with a number of grocery stores in Holland around actually having the true price be part of the sort of advertisement for the products, so consumers can both know, and then they could actually choose to pay that and when they pay that, that goes then to the farmers or whatever. So it's very complicated, and it's a great question, and there's not some easy answer to it. And it's something that I think the policy needs to lead on, and we need a lot. I think that there will be business innovation and also reshaping consumer demand.
Thanks so much. Yeah, no, I wasn't expecting you to have a silver bullet, but it just shows how complex this is, and that there's no easy answers.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to just dip back into our classroom context that many of us are part of. Michael, did you want to chime in on the question you posed?
Just thinking about my students going through some exercise that has all these constraints and using those constraints to enable innovation. But how do you have any suggestions in terms of how you can actually teach this without the students actually being gaslit? Like many of them just read the CSR reports or the sustainability reports and say, it's all great. What the companies do is already great, and we just need to tweak it a little bit, versus then being cynical, completely cynical. And how do you navigate that? And what do you see maybe a potential for scaling true hope in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I do think so in my teaching on this, in some of the slides that I showed are slides that I actually use in my teaching about the sort of value chain and Allbirds. I really try to think about different sort of problems that exist for companies, and then sort of showcase various case studies where companies are not. I mean, I think it's actually more deep, thoughtful engagements. So one example, I teach a class on circularity, and that's that value chain sort of stream diagram is from that. And thinking about and having discussions about for companies, like just even Allbirds or Patagonia, like how can they think about at different points on the value chain actually helping foster circularity. So you think about like very, very far upstream. I mean, it's about like how can we think about different materials and different ways of sort of growing and responsible and equitable to avoid avoid some of these externalities, to all the way through consumer, thinking about ways of creating secondhand marketplaces or repair or whatever. So I don't have a lot of sort of looking at large companies and CSR reports. I try to think about like what are some tangible problems or interventions, and show some case studies of companies that I've studied or I know about, or there's case studies written, and then also have the students try to discuss and contribute. So for instance, that circularity, there's 4 different sort of ways to think about circularity. I'm blanking on them right now, but I actually have like a brainstorming session of companies that they've seen or used that use one of those 4 types. And it's actually pretty impressive, the creativity that companies are doing in that's one example of the space. So I wish I had some sort of silver bullet, but on that as well. But I think, I truly try to stay away from the large company marketing. And I criticize a lot of companies too, like Pepsi, and I call a lot of companies out. And the students then become very comfortable in doing that too in class.
Thank you, Chris. We have just about arrived at the end of our hour of a necessary conversation. So on behalf of the International Humanistic Management Association, I'd like to thank Chris for joining us today and sharing this insight, and all of you for joining as well. Again, the recording will be available. The slides will be available. We'll get that out to you as soon as we can. Join any events that look good to you. I put several in the chat. For those of you for whom we didn't get to your questions, the chat is alive, it's living. That's also something we can share with everyone, and you're welcome, it sounds like, to reach out to Chris as well. So thank you very much. Thank you, Chris.
Please, people should feel free to reach out for me. One of the great things about doing these events is getting to know sort of new and different people. So please send me an email, send me a LinkedIn message, whatever. Would love to hear from you. And thank you all. Michael, Erica, for inviting me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Bye,
Thank you
everybody.
all.
Great.